This is a reading of the memories and recollections of Irene Doris Nelson, a woman of ordinary acclaim who was born and lived a modest but very rich life in the beginning of the 20th century. At some point in her adult life, Irene took pause to write down memories of being a child in this much simpler time. In doing so, she recalls for us the names and faces of her own family, her relatives, friends and neighbors, and the events that framed this period both in her own small town and in her country at large. We meet and come to know her mama, as Irene called her, and her dad, brothers and sisters, devoted neighbors, eclectic uncles married to compromising aunts, and a dear, dear cousin, all of whom encircle her in the love and support that forms a healthy, happy child. And, well, a contented human being, too. With delicious but tidy detail, she makes apparent her house and the family farm, the tools and appliances of labor, entertainment and support found through her church and community, and she reveals the awe and near disbelief of some of the newfangled inventions of the early 20th century, contraptions that stupefy us no longer. Finally, and without meaning to, she underscores the mannerisms and behaviors, the morals and norms, the communal conventions of that time by exposing the common courtesies practiced by everyone that comprised good life and good living. There was just a right way and a wrong way to be with and treat people, ways that are not so strongly practiced anymore. Irene devised this nostalgia with 60 short stories, each story about the size of a modest, multi-sentenced paragraph. If you were sitting on a front porch with Irene, sentimentally indulging in time past with fondness, you might hear any of these short vignettes from her childhood history. So let's begin now with this memorandum, which is entitled, "And That's the Way It Was, 1912 to 1925, by Irene Doris Nelson." Story number 1. I was born on the family farm in Shelby County, Iowa, on January 18, 1912. It had been an extremely cold winter, and my father often related to me how he had worked that winter to keep the road open for the doctor, who had to drive his team of horses out from Harlan into the bitter cold night. He had upset on the way. He told my parents that he would never again go alone when it was so cold, as he could have easily frozen to death if he had been hurt and unable to move. Story number 2. There were 2 memories that I have from my early childhood, and I'm not sure which occurred first. One took place when I was 2 years old. My mother had returned home from Des Moines, where she had had an appendectomy. She sat down in a chair, and I backed up to her, indicating by that I wanted to sit in her lap. She smiled and shook her head, telling me that she was unable to lift me. I remember that she wore a long black skirt and a white blouse. In those days, an operation for appendicitis was a very serious thing. When she left home, my 2 sisters related to me that they had felt they would never see their mother and my mother alive again, and they had taken me with them out behind the ice house and cried. Nellie was 15 years old, and Esther was 13. They were left in charge to wash, iron, cook, etc., as well as take care of me. They were very mature and trustworthy girls. Story number 3. The other very early memory was of a cold winter night when we were going to church in a bobsled. I think it was Christmas Eve. My mother came with a gray wool shawl and was going to wrap me in it just like I was a little baby. I kicked and waved my arms around, and in no way was I going to be subjected to such an indignity. I don't recall who won out, but I do remember how much fun it was to go in the bobsled and listen to the jingle, jingle of the bells on the horse's harness. Story number 4. We had a minister in our church when I was small that used to preach on and on and on. One Sunday I became very tired of it all, and right out loud I said to my mother, "If you don't take me out, I'll scream and scream and scream, ... She took me out and gave me a good spanking, and then I did scream. I don't believe I ever used this tactic again. Story number 5. When I was small, the United States became involved in World War I. My brother, Herman, had to go. I remember taking him to the train in Harlan. He picked me up and kissed me goodbye. I didn't really fully realize what it was all about and how sad a parting it was until I saw Nellie crying, as though her heart would break. Then I began to cry too. We all worried about him when he was gone. Our dog, Sport, missed his buddy too. Story number 6. Everyone was very patriotic during the war. We sang war songs about the Kaiser and how we were going to make him do the goose step to a good old American rag. And there was another one about a long, lean country gink, spelled Gink, that couldn't wait to sign up even if he didn't know what the war was all about. There was none of this "I won't go" stuff that you hear so much of today. I remember witnessing a terrible thing at that time. Some men had tied a man that was evidently of German descent to the back of a car, and they were dragging him behind this car on the courthouse square in Harlan. The people were yelling, "Pro-German, pro-German." This was going too far for patriotism. My parents did not approve of this and would never call out pro-German to anyone. Story number 7. After Herman left, we decided to go to Camp Dodge, close to Des Moines, to visit him. A neighbor boy was also stationed there, so we took his girlfriend along to visit him too. I remember Herman and Al coming to the fence to talk to us. We stayed with the Ladal family, spelled Lawdahl, who lived in Des Moines. They were friends and had often visited us on the farm. They took us to a dime store, and I was allowed to buy a toy watch. I was so thrilled with it. Story number 8. On the way home, I somehow leaned against the door of our car, and it opened, and I fell right out of the car. I hit the ditch, but was not hurt, only bruised. Sylvia, Al's girl, screamed, and Dad stopped the car as quickly as he could. They were relieved when they saw me running back toward the car. Of course, I was scared and crying. Later on, I discovered I had lost my precious watch, and this brought on more tears. Mama promised she would ask Naomi Lada to buy me another watch, and she did, but it was not like the one I lost. But I learned to be happy with that one too. Story number 9. I remember Herman's surprise homecoming. We had been out someplace, and he waited until we were all back in the house. Then he stepped out of my grandma's room, and we were surprised and overjoyed to have our son and brother home safely from France. Story number 10. I also remember Armistice Day. It was November 11th. Early in the morning, Leonard, our neighbor boy, rode a horse into our yard and yelled, "The war is over." We were still in bed and it was dark, but we got up and we went to Harlan to celebrate. What excitement! No one worked that day. Story number 11. When I was small, we built a new house. We tore down the old house and used some of the lumber from it to build the new house. During this time, we cleaned out our cob house and made living quarters out of it. At night, we had to cross the farmyard to sleep in the corn crib where we had set up beds. When it would rain, which it frequently did, my dad would pick me up and carry me across the muddy yard to go to bed. Story number 12. We kids had fun watching the carpenters work. We were the sidewalk superintendents, and I suppose the carpenters must have been sick of us sitting around watching them. One of them brought me some candy one day, which got him in solid with me. Neckos. Narration note: Neckos, spelled Neccos, which was an old wafer-like sugar candy. Story number 13. The day came when it was time to pick out our light fixtures. For this, we had to go to Omaha, Nebraska. I had never been to a large city before, and I could hardly believe my eyes when I saw all those tall buildings. I don't remember whether my neck was sore the next day or not, but I do remember the salesman taking us to a posh place for lunch. Now, this was a new experience for me. At the end of the meal, they brought finger bowls, and I proceeded to vigorously wash my hands. Mama was so embarrassed. She knew that you were supposed to dip your fingertips into the water. Well, I learned a valuable lesson about finger bowls that day. However, in all my years of life, I was never again in a situation where I could put this bit of knowledge into practice. Story number 14. I used to enjoy having the Watkins man and the Raleigh man come to sell their products. Mama always tried to buy all she could for them to help them out. There was also a peddler called Old Simmel, spelled Simmel. He came selling all sorts of things, and he had some jewelry. I saw a butterfly pin that I wanted so much, and I asked my mother if I could have it, and she said no. Neil Berg, spelled Berg, my future brother-in-law, was there, and he detected how very much I wanted that pin and how disappointed I was. He bought it for me and made a little girl so happy. I have always loved Neil for this. Story number 15. Maybe I should write out what I can remember of our old house. The kitchen had a wood floor with a trapdoor in it. You pulled this door up, and under it were steps leading to the cellar. There was a bathroom off the kitchen with a tub, but no running water. There was a pump at the sink, and no one got to come to the table without a visit to the bathroom to wash our hands. They were really dirty sometimes. We played with the dog and the cats, and sometimes we let the little calves suck on our hands. So washing our hands was necessary for reasons of sanitation. I remember the steps in the old house were unusual. There were a few steps to a landing, and then the steps divided. If you went to the west, you reached the girls' room, and if you went to the east, you reached the boys' room and the guest room. The guest room was covered with a fiber rug that was laid as carpet is laid today. If my brothers and sisters should ever read this, they may find some errors, as they have clearer memories of the old house than I do. Story number 16. In 1918, there was a terrible epidemic of influenza, and people were dying like flies. People were terrified, and every day brought news of the deaths of the people we knew. The Tobias sisters wore masks to the graveside rites of their relative, Harry Hanson, spelled Hanson. They did not dare to have funerals in churches, and funeral homes were non-existent then. Undertakers came to homes to prepare bodies for burial. Our family all came down with it at once, all but my mother, and she cared for all of us. Uncle John, vending, spelled Vinding, came to do our chores. Our pigs had the flu also, and Uncle John became ill. We thought he got it from our hogs. Carrie Peterson died after eating a fried egg. She had been sick, but when she felt better she became hungry and ate the egg. Everyone thought the egg had caused her death. To my knowledge, there has never in my life been an epidemic of such magnitude as the flu of 1918. Story number 17. When I was small, people used to go to church in buggies and carriages. There was a long barn by the church for the horses to stand while the service was going on. However, more and more people were buying cars. We had a four-door car called a Rambler. It also had a jump seat in the back, so it would hold more passengers if need be. This was attached to the back of the front seat and folded up or could be pulled down. All cars were started with a crank in the front of the car, and the choke was also out front by the crank. The car would jump and lurch along when we would first start it, and Dad had Marshall lie out on the fender and pull the choke until the car got warmed up and ceased its lurching and jumping. Then he cautiously crawled back into the car. The lights had to be lit with a match and were not very bright at any time. It was quite a sight after church on Sunday night to see the men cranking the cars and striking matches to light the lights on the car. Most all cars were touring cars, and if it would rain, we would put on side curtains with a small glass peek hole for light. You always carried the side curtains, and if it began to rain when you were driving, you got very busy putting on the curtains. Story number 18. One of the happiest things about my childhood was the times I got to go over to Grand Heights, to the farm, to visit Uncle John, Aunt Mary, and my dear cousin Alice. Alice and I were about the same age, and we were both gifted with terrific imagination. We could pretend for hours on end, pretend husbands, pretend children, pretend furniture, pretend trips, etc., etc. After Sunday school, Alice and I would beg our mothers to let us go either to her house or mine for the afternoon to play. We mostly always were allowed to do this, due to Alice's powers of persuasion. My mother predicted that she would become a lawyer. She was this good. Sunday evening found two tired little girls back in evening church service, and more often than not, we fell asleep and had to be carried out by our good dads, who understood we had had a very busy day. Story number 19. At this point, I must say something about the way Alice and I cooperated in our play. We always played house, and each of us set up our own housekeeping establishment. We would divide our toys by taking 2 items, and the hostess would say something like, "What do you want, the coffee pot or the tea kettle?" Or, "What do you want, the stove or the cupboard?" The company always got first choice. Sometimes when I see children quarreling over toys, I think of how well Alice and I used to get along, and to my knowledge, our parents never right out told us this was a good way to do. I am sure their way of life rubbed off on us, and we learned to treat each other with kindness. I am sure their way of life rubbed off on us, and we learned to treat each other with kindness. They lived by the good book, and what better way is there for anyone to live? Story number 20. We also had get-togethers with the Thompson clan, spelled Thomson. Such fun to go to Uncle Pete and Aunt Emma's, and to get to play the player piano. My favorite was Falling Waters. The thunder, lightning, and the falling raindrops were very realistic. Uncle Pete had the first radio that I ever listened to. You had to put on earphones, and sitting there in the dining room, the song, Ain't A Gonna Rain No More was heard from way down in Shenandoah, Iowa. It was almost unbelievable at that time that such a thing was possible. My Grandma Nelson never did believe it. She always maintained that we had put something in it, like a record. She died in 1929. Story number 21. Another memory of my childhood was when Uncle Jacob would drive into our yard with Aunt Steen, spelled S-T-I-N-E, and Ruth, Verna, and I don't remember how many more of his large family. They came for a surprise visit. We were always delighted to see them, but boy did we get busy. We made beds, killed chickens, made ice cream, etc., etc. Aunt Steen was very ambitious, and she had made Ruth a nightgown with a crocheted insertion patterned with ducks. How I wanted a nightie like that with ducks. I didn't have a nightie with any kind of insertion, let alone with ducks. When Uncle Jacob's older children got married, the surprise visits to us stopped as they went to visit their own children. How I missed them and the excitement their visits caused. Story 22. When I was small, there was a second house on our farm. It was Grandma Nelson's house. I remember going over there to have a visit with her. She didn't speak the English language, but we somehow managed to communicate, and I learned a little Danish. She would let me drink coffee, a no-no at home. We would dunk stale crackers into the coffee. She was really like something out of a novel. She always wore the same style dress. They were always blue, ankle length, and gathered at the waist. When she went outside, she wore a three-cornered white scarf tied around her chin and an apron in which she would gather sticks up that she found in the yard. She had an unusual pump by her front door. There were little cups on a revolving chain that went down into the water when you turned the crank. The water came up and spilled out into a pail. This was not for drinking, as it was rainwater. Story number 23. When we built the new house, we built a room and a bath for Grandma. She did not take to modern conveniences. She continued to use her pot instead of the stool, then emptying the contents of the pot into the stool. She used an old black wash basin, which she placed on the lavatory, and she would always make a big mess when she washed her hands, after being outside, grubbing around. Story number 24. She had a clock that had a lady on the pendulum. I remember watching this lady swing back and forth as the minutes and hours went by. She also had a fancy rope over her bed, fastened to the ceiling to help her get up and out of bed. It was a special Danish name, but I do not remember it. Nellie and Neil said it is called a sange bone, spelled S-A-N-G-E-B-O-A-N. Narrator's note: this story still refers to Grandma Nelson, and there is what appears to be a date at the end of this. 3 numbers, parentheses 8-2-82, which might be an indication of when at least this paragraph was typed out. August 2nd, 1982. Story number 25. We had a furnace in our home, but this did not keep Grandma warm enough. She had her own wood stove, but she mostly burned cobs in it. She carried the cobs from the basement of our house. She scattered cob dust through our kitchen and dining room as she went. It was so hot in her room that no one else could stand it. Story number 26. We as a family had our problems with Grandma. Quite often we had neighbors and friends in for an evening of visiting. Refreshments in the form of coffee and cake and maybe sandwiches were always served. If we went in to invite Grandma to join us, she was mad because we had disturbed her rest. If we did not go in and invite her, we were in trouble with her. Then she would want to move back to her house. Dad and the boys would carry her furniture back to her house, and in a few days she would come crying and want to move back in with us again. Then the men had to move her back. This happened many times. One day she fell and broke her hip, and this caused pneumonia to set in, and she died. She was 89, I believe. Mama bought Grandma a dress for her burial, and this was the first time that any of us saw her in a different style of dress. Story number 27. Now let me say a little bit about my other grandmother, Grandma Vending, who lived over on Grand Heights Farm with Aunt Mary and Uncle John, but sometimes my mother invited her to our house for a visit. I remember this always made Grandma Nelson jealous. She was sometimes rude to Grandma Vending, but sometimes they would visit and discuss which one of them would die first. Each thought they would be the first to go. It so happened that Grandma Vending died first, and she also died of a broken hip and pneumonia, just like Grandma Nelson. I remember Grandma Vending trying to help when she was visiting us. She also spoke only Danish, and she had trouble pronouncing our dog's name, which was Sport. She would go outside with the table scraps for Sport, calling, "Spurt! Oh, Spurt!" Poor Sport didn't know whether he was to have it or if it was for someone else. Story number 28. Oh yes, I must relate how Brother Arlo and I kept all our cousins from coming to my sister Nellie's wedding. Every June, Cuppy's Grove Church had a Children's Day program. How we hated to get up in front of all of those people and speak our pieces. The whooping cough was going around, and Cousin Mamie's kids had it. Arlo and I decided we would pretend we had whooping cough, then we would not have to be in that old program. We began to cough, and even kinda choked like we might throw up. Sure enough, it was so realistic that Mama thought we had it. However, we had forgotten one thing. Nellie and Neil were getting married, and the kids that hadn't had whooping cough had to stay home. This included Cousin Alice. Every crime has its own punishment, and this was mine. Story number 29. Another time I couldn't eat all my breakfast, and it was a rule at our house that we had to clean our plates. If we took it, we had to eat it. Our dining room table was square, and each corner had a little triangular shelf in it for support, I suppose. That day I cautiously placed this pancake that I couldn't eat in the corner of the table down under the tablecloth. Somehow or other, when my mother was cleaning, the table got reversed, and the pancake landed by the place where my brother Marshall always sat. When Mama did her semi-annual house cleaning, she found it. Marshall got called on the carpet for this crime. He protested vigorously and denied that he had done it. But, poor boy, his story was not believed, and he had to eat that old, dried-up, and probably dusty pancake. I suppose my conscience hurt me, for later in life I confessed to Marshall that I was the one that had done it. By this time he could even laugh about it, but it was not funny to him at the time. Story number 30. The Nishnabotna River that ran out near our farm flooded sometimes, and this caused lots of excitements from time to time. Bridges would be washed out, and this caused all kinds of inconvenience. I recall they built a footbridge so Arlo, Jake Jerry, and myself could go to school. One time they built something so that vehicles could cross the river. It consisted of planks wide enough for wheels of a car. One day I accompanied Dad on a trip over to Uncle John Vending's farm. I always took the opportunity to go there to play with Alice. We drove the long way over there, but on the way home, we decided to try the planks. Dad stopped the car, got out and surveyed the situation, got back in the car, aimed the wheels at the planks, and over the river we went. I was scared to death, and I still remember the look on his face as he carefully steered the car over the makeshift bridge. Needless to say, I breathed a sigh of relief when we reached the other side. It looked like a raging river down there to a scared little girl. Story number 31. Now I must say something about Jake Jerry. His name was Jake Christensen, but his dad's name was Jerry Christensen, and so those kids were called Jake Jerry, Effie Jerry, Cecil Jerry, and etc., etc. Jake was always trying to trade his lunch if he saw something that he would like to have when we were eating lunch at school. "I'll trade you that banana for this sandwich," he would say. Poor Jake never had too much luck with his bartering, for to have a banana or an orange in your syrup-pail lunch bucket was a rarity. It just didn't happen very often. We mostly had sandwiches, cookies, or cake, and maybe once in a while a cinnamon roll. To this day, I love cinnamon rolls. Mama would take some of the dough when she baked bread and doctor it up some way, and the cinnamon rolls were absolutely delicious. They tasted so good when we got home from school. Story number 32. In one way, Jake was lucky. He had a pony named Spunk. Jake would ride Spunk across the field that separated our farms and pick up Arlo and me, and away we went, all three of us, on the back of that poor pony. When we arrived at Cuppy Grove School, Jake would say, "Go home, Spunk," and Spunk took off for home as fast as he could go. All my childhood life I longed to have a pony. We used to get some kind of publication, and in it told how you could win a pony, but I don't know just what you had to do to get it. I used to dream of winning that pony, but like so many dreams that children had back then, it just never came true. Parents at that time were afraid of spoiling their children, and so to have a wish granted was a rarity. The closest I ever came to having a pony was Jake Jerry's Spunk. Story number 33. Cuppy's Grove, as it was years ago, was a wonderful place to be as a child. The river, the pond, the woods with wildflowers, and the wild plums, gooseberries, blackberries, red haws, wild grapes, and sweet wild strawberries made it a paradise for children. Every season had its special pleasures. Story number 34. In the winter we brought our sleds to school, and at noon we would gobble our lunch as fast as we could and then head for the 2 hills east of school. It was really a wonder we didn't get killed. I had inherited Marshall's sled, and boy could it go, especially if I could get a girl in our school that was a little heavy on the sled with me. One day the roads were icy, and this girl and I started down the first hill, past the deep ravine at the bottom, and made it to the top of the second hill, and then on down that one. This miracle, in all upper caps, this miracle only happened once in my lifetime. But had we landed in the ravine at the bottom of the hill, I probably wouldn't be here writing this right now. Story 35. Springtime brought its flower-picking joys. On our way home there was a most delightful, intriguing place. There were steep banks where wild flowers grew. We would scramble up and down the banks to pick Dutchman's breeches, jack-o'-lanterns, jack-in-the-pulpits, violets, and ferns. In June the wild roses came out, and I remember getting my fingers full of thorns. But it was worth it. My mother was always glad for our contributions, and they were put in a glass of water and enjoyed until they faded. Story number 36. Summer had its joys too, but it also was a time when we had to help with the work. I remember when it was time to thresh the grain. The wheat and oats had been cut with a binder. The grain came out with twine around the stalks, and these bundles were put together in piles called shocks, spelled S-H-O-C-K-S. This was all done by hand. Several of the neighbors got together and formed a threshing ring. That is, they helped each other when it was time to thresh. Threshing was the process of separating the grain from the straw. They purchased a big threshing machine together, and a shed was built on our farm to house it. Before this, we used to get Cecil Shack to come with his threshing machine with its big steam engine to do the threshing. When your turn came to thresh, the men would come with their teams and hay racks and go into the field where some of the men pitched the bundles from the shocks into the hay rack, and then it was hauled to the threshing machine, and the bundles thrown into it, and the machine separated the grain from the straw. The straw was blown into a stack, and the grain went into a wagon, and this was taken to the granary and hand-scooped into the granary. The straw was later baled and stored in the barn for use in bedding the cattle for the winter. The grain was used for feed and also sold to be made into flour and other grain products. The women worked hard cooking for the men on threshing day. We usually had fried chicken, potatoes, cabbage slaw, cucumbers, big bowls of tomatoes, bread and butter and jam, canned fruit, and pie. In the afternoon, we provided coffee, lemonade, sandwiches, and cake. It was a source of satisfaction to see those hungry men enjoying the food. They were always full of fun, and there was always a lot of laughing and joking. Story number 37. In the summer, the cows were out to pasture. It was my job to go after them and bring them home when it was time to milk. Sometimes I would walk, accompanied by our dog, Sport. Sport helped round up the ones that had to go home to be milked, and he knew which ones they were. He would bark at them and nip at their legs and get them going. Sometimes I would leave Sport at home and ride Sam, one of our horses, to get the cows. Sometimes when Sport and I were walking after the cows, I would see tumbling bugs. They were fun to watch. 2 bugs would have a ball of mud, and they would push it and roll it over and over. I never did discover where they were going with it or what the purpose was in their activity, but it was fascinating to watch them. Story number 38. Every summer, Arlo and I got the job of picking potato bugs. How we hated that. It seemed Dad always decided it had to be done on the hottest, muggiest day of the summer. He gave each of us a can of kerosene, and we picked the bugs off the potato plants and dropped them into the kerosene. Maybe this is one of the reasons I have never liked hot summer. But when Dad said to do something, we knew better than to try to get out of it. Story number 39. At the far end of our sidewalk was our little house, or back house, or whatever you wanted to call it. Ours was a 3-holer, 2 big and 1 little. In the winter, my mother tacked flannel on the little hole for us when we were little, so it wouldn't be so cold. Our Sears and Roebuck catalogs were used for toilet paper, all except for the slick pages, because they were not so absorbent. Everyone did this. We had flush toilets in the house, but to save water, we were told to use the outhouse as much as possible. In the winter, we were allowed to go inside the house. The little house was an excellent place to go when it was just about time to do the dishes. Esther and I used to sit in there until we were pretty sure the dishes were done. We would look in the catalogs and discuss what styles we liked and didn't like. Story number 40. On a hot day, we would beg to go swimming in the tank where the horses and cattle drank. Dad always said no, as it stirred up the green moss, and then the animals wouldn't drink. One day we went in the tank without permission. Dad saw us and sneaked up and dunked Marshall's head under the water. When Marshall came up, he was so mad. He yelled an obscenity at Dad, but Dad just laughed and walked off. I wouldn't be surprised if at that time he wasn't losing his hearing, or I doubt if Marshall would have gotten away with this outburst. Dad gradually became deaf, but when it first started, he said it was because we all mumbled. Story number 41. One of the joys of summer was all of the fresh fruit and vegetables that we grew. We had such an abundance of everything, and we never had to spray or anything. Our apples were not wormy. We had many varieties of apples. We also had plums, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, cherries, grapes, and mulberries. We had currants, too. Mama always had a big garden, and we kids used to love the fresh peas. Mama complained she had a hard time getting enough for a meal because our eating them right from the pod, and sometimes even eating the pods. That must have been very good for us. We also liked to take the salt shaker outside and pluck a nice ripe tomato and eat it like an apple. Story number 42. One of the things that was an annual event for Mama was a trip to the woods to pick gooseberries. How she loved this. She would come home with a great big sack, a flour sack, 100 pounds. Then we all had to get busy and help stem them. This also was not one of our favorite things to do, but we did it, and no one dared to complain too much. We would sit out on the back porch to do this. Eventually this would be done, and we could get on with more pleasant pursuits. Mama canned those sour things, and I don't know why, as nobody really liked them too much. Story number 43. I wasn't very old when I had to help with putting up hay. At first I felt very proud that they would trust me to drive the horses down the long rows of raked hay. When the hay rack was loaded, I was completely buried in the hay, and my brother, whichever one was doing the loading, would have to get a hold of me and pull me up on top of the load, and then we would ride together to the barn where it was unloaded. It wasn't long, however, until I wished I didn't have to do this. It was sometimes hot and very uncomfortable being buried in the hay, and the hay was scratchy, and having to drive the horses, you were unable to do anything about that. But, as with the other work, you knew better than to complain, as it had to be done, and everyone was working hard. Later on, I was promoted to leading the horse that pulled the hay into the barn. And then later, they began using a team of horses to do this. This was really hard, as it involved a thing called a double tree, and you had to manage that thing as well as handle the horses. Story number 44. One of the nicest things that we did in the summer was to make ice cream. The boys would get the notion to do this after supper and after the chores were done. They would go to the ice house and get a couple of big chunks of ice. This ice came from our pond and had been cut and stored in the winter for our use in the summer. Besides making ice cream with it, we used it for our ice box. There were no refrigerators back then. Town kids would chase the ice wagon down the street and beg for a chunk of ice from the man that was delivering it. However, in the country, we were pretty lucky to have our own supply of ice. Mama would get busy and stir up the mixture while the boys washed the ice off and crushed it up. Then Mama would have it ready, and the boys got it all together and put coarse salt on it, on the ice. We would take turns turning the crank, and after a while it became very hard to turn, and you knew it was done. Next, we would take the lid off and remove the dasher. We would all come with our spoons to sample it to see if it was good, and of course it was always good. Later on in the evening we would eat it, and we could have our cake or cookies with it if we wanted. When the strawberries were ripe, it tasted so good to put them on the ice cream. Sometimes, before we had the ice cream, we would play croquet on our big green lawn. Story number 45. Arlo saved his money and bought himself a bicycle. I remember the thrill I had when I mastered riding it. Arlo and I used to trap gophers, and we would cut their feet off and put them in salt, and take them to Harlan, to the courthouse, where we would be paid 10 cents. This was called a bounty. I did not know if this was where we got the money for the bike or not, but that is one way in which kids could earn a little extra money. Sometimes I rode the bike to visit the neighbors, Lizzie Samuels. She lived right down the road, and I used to go visit her. She let me read her True Story magazines. Now, Mama would really have let Lizzie have it if she had known this was going on, but this was Lizzie and my big secret. I really learned a lot from those magazines. What big messes some of those people got themselves into. Story number 46. In the fall, we started back to our one-room country school. I was always anxious for school to start. I loved school. My studies were not hard for me, and I never felt at any disadvantage from having attended a school with all 8 grades in one room. Oh, I guess the kids in Harlan that had Annie Carmichael for grammar knew that subject better than we did, as she really drilled it into them. She had a real tough look on her face, and everybody sat up and took notice. Cousin Alice had moved to Harlan and attended that school, and I remember feeling sorry for Alice having to take grammar from Miss Carmichael. I visited the school with her sometimes, but even if I didn't have Annie C for grammar, I got by. Story number 47. Fall was the time to pick corn. I was no good at this. I wasn't strong enough to husk it. It took me too long, and Arlo considered me a dud at it. But the boys really worked hard and got up in the dark and picked until dark. No one stayed up late during corn picking. Mama tried to cook extra good then, because the men were working so hard. We had an elevator to transfer the corn from the wagon to the corn crib. Most of our neighbors had to hand scoop the ears into the corn crib. I used to like to listen to the noise that the elevator made when the corn was being unloaded. It meant supper would soon be on the table, and the tired men would be able to rest a while before going to bed. Story number 48. When I was going to country school, we sometimes would see a covered wagon full of gypsies driving by our school. We were so afraid of them. We had heard that they would kidnap children and take them with them, never to be seen by their parents again. After we had seen them, we would hurry home and go especially fast past those banks where we picked wildflowers in the spring. We expected them to be lurking there, ready to grab us. They would come to our door sometimes, usually sending a little child to beg for a chicken so they could make some chicken soup. They always had such a sad tale to tell. My mother believed in helping her fellow man, and she would grant their request. Mama also fed all tramps, and had no fear of them at all. The sheriff came to our place once to find a tramp that had been reported to be in the community. Mildred Peterson had reported him. The sheriff found him having coffee and cake in the kitchen with my mother. He was harmless, but the sheriff told him to get out of Shelby County. Story 49. Sometime in the early 1920s, I remember seeing my first airplane. It flew over our farm, and we all ran out of the house to view this spectacle. From horse and carriage to cars to airplanes in so few years. Would these miracles never cease? Story number 50. Being the youngest of a family of 6, I had to endure an awful lot of teasing. Herman had been teasing me, and I had had just about all I could take. We were sitting at the table, and I picked up my bowl of oatmeal and slammed it down, and the dish broke. This is one time that I did not get punished. I guess Mama knew there was a limit to what a little girl could stand in the way of teasing. Arlo used to get me to do his bidding by telling me he would harm my dolls if I didn't do what he said. Story number 51. Arlo raised rabbits. He had one black one which was his pride and joy, and he instructed me to watch him that he didn't run away when he was cleaning out the cage. Somehow that rabbit did get out in spite of me and was never to be seen or heard from again. I felt just awful, but Arlen was pretty mad at me for a long time. Story number 52. When Esther was teaching school, she and I contracted the scarlet fever. We had to stay in our room for 6 weeks. We were quarantined. People felt sorry for us. And I remember Mrs. Cartensen, spelled Carstensen, who was our minister's wife, brought us some beautiful yellow mums, the kind that girls wear at football games. She also brought us some delicious pudding. Being quarantined was no fun for Arlo, and he got bored. To relieve his boredom, he wheeled our phonograph to the party telephone line and rang 6 shorts, which was to call everyone on the line to come to the phone for special announcements. He then played the records for the neighbors. The neighbors really got a kick out of this and responded by asking for more. I suppose this was a treat, for there were no radios to listen to, and many of our neighbors didn't have phonographs like we did. I was in bed with the scarlet fever for 3 weeks, as my fever just wouldn't go away. They finally let me get up anyway. I was really sick for a few days, but after 6 weeks we fumigated the house and we were all out of jail at last. Esther could go back to her teaching, and I could go back to school. The kids acted half scared of me. People then thought the scales were contagious. After the scarlet fever, your skin peeled off. It was later determined that the scales were not contagious, but I felt like an outcast for a while anyway. Story number 53. One of my remembrances is of our family gathered at the breakfast table, where Dad took time to read the Bible every day and have a prayer. Many children have never had this experience. I suppose we didn't always listen as well as we should have, but it is an experience that I'm glad I had. Dad always asked for forgiveness for our sins and for our shortcomings. He prayed this every day. Other times, prayer would be for specific things, such as a sick neighbor, or a friend, or a family member. Our parents set a good example for us in the Christian way of living. As I said before, they lived by the good book. Story 54. When I was 10 years old, I became an aunt. Nellie and Neil became the parents of Robert Delmore Berg. It was 3 months before I got to see him. Then they came to live with us for a while because Neil had not been feeling well. I was the proudest aunt in all of Shelby County, and maybe even in the whole state of Iowa. Alice and I came as near to getting into trouble over this as anything that we had encountered thus far, because she became an aunt at about the same time I did. I would brag about Bobby and all the things he could do, and Alice would counter with all of Delbert's accomplishments. We were a couple of dedicated 10-year-old aunts. When Nellie, Neil, and Bobby left to move to Des Moines, I was about as sad as I have ever been in my whole life. My whole world seemed to fall apart. Story number 55. A few years later, I had another big blow. Esther, my big sister, left home to go to California to get married. She had told me a long time before this that she was going to do this. She threatened all kinds of dire things that would happen to me if I ever told this. You had better believe I never mentioned it, not even to Sport or to the cats. When it actually came to pass, it was hard. I missed her so much. Our dog, Old Sport, wondered where she had gone. He never went any place in our house but the kitchen, but then he disappeared. We found him upstairs in Esther's closet. He was curled up in there near some of the clothes that she had left behind. Story number 56. Esther loved clothes and knew how to fix herself up. I liked to watch her getting ready to go places. She would curl her hair with a curling iron that you warmed by putting it on a kerosene lamp. Sometimes she would fix me up too, curling my hair. You can see why I was so devastated when she left. Here I was, a freshman in high school, with no big sister to help me with my clothes and hair curling. My mother was also having a hard time with loneliness. Besides her feelings of loneliness, she had broken her wrist in a fall the morning we took Esther to the train to bid her goodbye. But life does have its hard times, and no one escapes times of sadness and loneliness. Story number 57. Then, a year later, Marshall married and brought Edith Esperson, spelled Espersen, into the family. Now this helped a great deal. She had been a beauty operator, and she took me over and got me to looking some better. She could marcel hair, spelled Marcel, and also do haircuts. Alice's mother told me I was lucky to have Edith around, as she had really improved my looks. Edith was the one that told me about venereal disease, which scared the wits out of me. I avoided the toilets in the school. I was so afraid of picking up that germ. Edith said something that needed to be said. Edith helped me to fill the void left by Esther, and I have always felt a special bond with her. Story number 58. One day in our freshman year at high school, Alice and I decided to play house. We divided up the toys in the usual way, and then we looked at each other and just laughed. The magic had died for us. We never again played house. Now we were to embark on a new and different set of interests. A narration note. The sentence, "The magic had died for us," is the only sentence in this document that is underlined, and there is an exclamation point. Story number 59. Almost 100 miles away in Buena Vista County were two young men destined to become our husbands. One lived near Alta, and the other lived near Newell, spelled Newell. They were blissfully unaware of their fate. Both lived on farms. We met at different times and under different circumstances. Alice and I have always agreed that Buena Vista County produced some pretty nice fellows. When Phil and Chet became acquainted, they liked each other immediately, and through the years maintained a friendship with each other. We always liked to have Alice and Chet to visit us, and we enjoyed visiting them. Our lives were so intertwined through the years that we have felt a special closeness that we could never experience with anyone else. And finally, story number 60, the ending. I wanted to write about these years as they were really quite different than the years that followed. I wanted my boys to have some idea of how things were then, and that's the way it was. Well, we have come to the end of this pilgrimage back to what feels like a simpler and more meaningful time. I really enjoyed this journey, and I wish there was more to come. I'm going to miss these folks. Herman, Marshall, and Arland, who slept on the west side, and Nellie, Esther, and our author, Irene, who slept on the east side. 6 fortunate siblings who lived together, worked together, played together, and prayed together, too. And then there was Dad, Cousin Alice, and of course the steadfast and loving matron of them all, Mama. Somewhere along the line I gave each of them a face and a personality in my own mind. Irene was canny in recalling the episodes she chose to reveal, and she was frugal and clever in her portrayal of them. Each little story could stand on its own, but together they painted a right and fitting impression of that time. And we never really knew what was going to come next. That was kind of fun. I am grateful to Irene for believing she could take us back in time, and even more so for having the will to actually sit down and push the keys on her typewriter, and I have to tell you, almost without error, too. And because she did this, she has made her family timeless, and has helped me, and perhaps you, understand, well, that's the way it was. Thanks for listening.